posted, and please watch those so that you can stay up to date and caught up on what we are doing. So last time we finished our look at the peak shift phenomenon. We finished our look at why it is that people would do very, very bizarre behaviors. And what we're going to do today is we're going to continue on with our look at Chapter 9. And now we're going to focus on punishment. So punishment is one of the two of the four major contingencies. So remember, we have positive or negative, reinforcement or punishment. So today we're going to focus in on punishment because punishment has some side effects, has some idiosyncrasies that you need to be aware of, drawbacks to punishment that you need to be aware of before you implement a punishment procedure. So we'll talk about the types of punishment. We'll talk about the problems that are associated with the use of punishment. We'll talk about some of the benefits of punishment. So it's not all bad news. There are some benefits of punishment that you can use very effectively, and how to effectively use punishment as well. So we're going to be talking about different types of punishment. So classically, when people think of punishment, oftentimes they think of physical punishment such as spanking. But punishment will include anything that decreases the probability of that target behavior. So whatever the punishment is a consequence of, whatever behavior this punishment is following, it's punishment if it decreases the probability of that behavior. So we have spanking as punishment. We have timeout as another form of punishment. We have taking away a very specific item. So in this case, this child is being punished by taking away a very specific toy. That's another type of punishment. And we're going to take a look at some of the side effects of punishment. So it's important to be aware of these side effects because punishment does not always operate the way that we would intuitively expect or hope for it to operate. So there's a lot of drawbacks to punishment, including just a generalized decrease in behavior. So if you want two children to play together nicely and you punish fighting behavior, you might in the end up with two children that just don't play together. So the fighting behavior has decreased, but the side effect of it is that the desired behavior, cooperative play, has decreased as well. It's gone. Another aspect of punishment that we'll take a look at is the fact that punishment oftentimes leads to a short-circuiting of the actual contingency. So as opposed to reinforcement, people that are being punished will oftentimes avoid the person who is applying the contingency. So if you work at in an office and you have a boss that continuously uses a punishment contingency to shape your behavior, you will find yourself eventually avoiding that boss, which is exactly the opposite of what any boss would want. And then we'll also take a look at one of the worst side effects for punishment, and that is that punishment can oftentimes get out of hand. So we're going to take a look at a very interesting scenario where the person who is being punished is under a particular punishment contingency, but unfortunately the punisher themselves, the person who is inflicting the punishment, is often on a reinforcement contingency for that punishment. And because of this, you have to be very, very careful when you're doing punishment as a behavioral treatment, because there's always the possibility that through that reinforcement, your punishment is going to get out of hand. And we've seen this in a very famous example in the Rodney King beatings. These officers were being reinforced for punishing individuals, for punishing suspects or other citizens, and they were reinforced with that punishment, and that's one of the reasons why it got so out of hand. All right, so all that and more today. So we're going to be taking a look at punishment specifically. So we'll take a look at the different types of punishment. So we are looking specifically at the red contingencies here. So we have both positive and negative punishment. And it's important to remember, especially now, what positive and negative means. So positive means that you present something as a consequence of the behavior, and then the punishment means that the behavior decreases as a result. Negative means that you remove something as a consequence of the behavior, and punishment again means that the behavior decreases as a result. And as we're going to see, many of the side effects, many of the unwanted aspects of punishment come across from positive punishment. So positive punishment is not the better punishment. Negative punishment is actually the safer contingency to go with. So let's start with positive punishment. Punishment where a behavior occurs, something is presented, and that causes the behavior to go down. So one classic example of positive punishment is spanking. So back in the day when it was seen as an appropriate behavioral modification tool for parents to spank their children, what would happen is that this child would do a target behavior that the parent wanted to decrease. So maybe the child used foul language. Maybe the child drew something on the walls in crayon. Maybe the child hit their sibling. And what they would do is, as a consequence of that, they would present something, specifically their hand, to the child's backside, specifically pain, physical pain, and that would cause the target behavior to decrease. Presenting something positive, target behavior decreases punishment. Spanking is an example of positive punishment. It doesn't always have to be spanking. We've also seen positive punishment in the Harry video. So in the Harry video, we saw that when Harry was getting into Dr. Fox's face, Dr. Fox then got right into Harry's face. That getting into his face, that was a positive consequence because Dr. Fox presented something to Harry, specifically his face. The amount of close talking and intimidation went down as a result of that. Positive punishment. Harry was under that contingency of positive punishment, and it decreased his close talking behavior. All right, and then we have positive punishment in the sense of these police officers here who are beating this suspect, Rodney King. They are implementing positive punishment. So whatever the behavior was that Rodney King did, whatever that target behavior was, they presented something. They presented batons to his head. They presented their boots to his kidneys. And the behavior, that target behavior decreased as a result. And that is an example of positive punishment. So again, very clear example of we don't mean good punishment. We don't mean approved punishment. We just mean something was presented that caused a decrease in the behavior. And this was one of the first examples of police brutality that was caught on film. So this was from back in the 90s before everybody had smartphones with built-in cameras in them. And this was one of the first times where it was brought to the nation's attention that these types of punishment procedures were being used by police. So hopefully this will play so that we can give you a little bit of context of exactly what happened back in that time. All right.
Who had the camera? Where was the camera? Oh my God, they caught this on camera.
It was one of the most disturbing things that we'd seen on video.
The videotaped beating of Rodney King left many Los Angeles residents outraged.
It was like the first time we had actually seen it, so it was shocking, but at the same time, it was wonderful because now we Americans, we African Americans, we had evidence of our claims of, injustice and mistreatment. The idea of watching.
All right, so you can check out the full video for some other highlights, but you can definitely see Rodney King. He was a suspect. He was the one on the ground. he did some target behavior, and that target behavior resulted in consequences. That was the police beatings, and that resulted in a decrease in that target behavior, and that would be an example of positive punishment. These individuals, these police officers, were later placed under a different contingency of negative punishment. So later on, they were, as a consequence of this beating, something was taken away. Specifically, their freedom was taken away. So freedom was taken away. As a result, the beatings decreased. So when they were placed in jail, that would be an example of negative punishment. So again, we can see that punishment can come in two different major forms, and the officers here were eventually under the contingency of negative punishment. Just to kind of give you a little bit of context, has anybody heard previously about the Rodney King trial and the Rodney King incident? So some of you are nodding your heads. For those of you that don't know the outcome of this, I mean, it's super hard to believe, given that footage, given the fact that, it's not entirely sure what the beginning of this incident was. So I've seen different versions of this footage, and I've never seen the target behavior that led to the positive punishment being instigated. But if you watch the full video, there is a long period of time where Rodney King was immobilized on the ground, and these police officers continued to beat him. So regardless of whether or not some sort of police force was justified, definitely the brutality, the amount of it was way more than required. So even if Rodney King, and again, I don't know what happened in the beginning, but even if he pulled a gun on these officers and they had to subdue him, after the first 20 seconds, he was subdued, and it's just continued to go on and on. Surprisingly, for some, maybe not for others, in their initial trial, a jury that saw that video of Rodney King being beaten actually acquitted all 4 officers of assault and acquitted 3 of the 4 for using excessive force. And the one that they didn't acquit, it was a hung jury. They could not come up with a verdict for the 4th one in terms of his excessive force. So basically all 4 of those officers initially got acquitted. Later on, they were tried, though, for violating Rodney King's civil rights. And on that retrial, they were convicted. All right, so talking about positive punishment. So positive is when something was presented, behavior decreased. That's an example of positive punishment. As I mentioned, there was these individuals went on trial. They were initially acquitted, and once they were acquitted, you saw there in the video, it was called, I think, the day LA burned. There was massive riots in Los Angeles. So there was massive looting in the streets. There were fires being set. This was the headline from the Los Angeles Times: fires and looting and fires ravage LA. 25 dead, 572 injured, 1,000 blazes reported. That was as a result of this verdict, of this acquittal of those 4 officers. And this is actually also an example of positive punishment. So the target behavior in this case was the acquittal of the 4 members, 4 police officers. What was presented was looting and fires and general mayhem. And the probability that those 4 officers got acquitted on a later trial actually did go down, because they were later found to be guilty of violating Rodney King's civil rights. So we can see that in this case, it's positive punishment. Fires and looting were being presented. The probability of them being acquitted went down. That's an example of positive punishment. Again, no way to take a look at this and say, oh yeah, that's great, that's approved, that's a positive outcome. But remember, positive and negative are used very, very differently in learning, especially when we're talking about these contingencies. All right, let's talk about negative punishment. Negative punishment is actually the preferred form of punishment these days. It's a preferred form of modifying behavior by using negative punishment. And one example of that is the prevalence of timeout procedures for children. So timeout procedures where you basically take away a lot of reinforcers. So when you're in timeout, basically you take away TV. You can't watch TV when you're staring at the wall. When you're in timeout, basically you take away running around. You can't run around when you're staring at the wall. When you're in timeout, you take away interactions with your parents, you know, hugs and kisses. You can't get hugs and kisses when you're in timeout. So whatever this child did, let's say that they drew with crayons on the wall. Once they drew with crayons on the wall, the consequence of that behavior was timeout. That's the taking away of a variety of different reinforcers, the opportunity to do a variety of behaviors, and that leads to a decrease in the behavior, and that is an example of negative punishment. As I mentioned previously, the officers that were eventually convicted had their freedoms taken away. Again, that's an example of negative punishment. So going to jail, being incarcerated, that's an example of negative punishment. So on the civil rights trial, it goes, a jury found Officer Lawrence Powell, that guy, and Sergeant Stacy Kuhn, that guy right there, guilty, and they were subsequently sentenced to 30 months in prison. Surprisingly, Timothy Wind and Theodore Briseno were acquitted of all charges. So 2 people went down for this. 2 people were placed under the contingency of negative punishment, had their rights removed, and were placed in incarceration in order to decrease police brutality. All right, so negative punishment, as we mentioned, there's 2 forms of negative punishment, 2 major forms of negative punishment. The first one is known as timeout, and the second one is known as response cost. So both of these fall under the terms of negative punishment. So let's take a look at each of those in turn. So in both cases, a target behavior occurs, something is taken away, that target behavior goes down. The difference between them depends upon what is taken away. So in the timeout procedure, in the timeout version of negative punishment, what's taken away is basically access to all positive reinforcers. So timeout procedure is where you isolate an individual so that they have no access to any reinforcers whatsoever. So sitting in front of a wall and staring at that wall for 30 seconds, 1 minute, however long the punishment, the timeout interval is, that's a loss of a number of different reinforcers, right? So TV, gone. Playing with toys, gone. Talking to your parents, gone. Getting juice from the fridge, gone. Cookies, gone. All those reinforcers are gone. So that's an example of timeout procedure. Getting sent to jail, also an example of the timeout procedure, because a wide variety of positive reinforcers are no longer available to these individuals. So the freedom to do whatever you want to do has been removed, and that's also an example of that timeout procedure. So in the timeout procedure, a large variety or a large number of reinforcers, most of those positive reinforcers get removed. That's what's taken away. That's the negative aspect of the punishment procedure. On the other end of the spectrum, we have response cost. And response cost is still the removal of something. It's still negative punishment. But response cost is where you remove a specific reinforcer following that problem behavior. So rather than removing all reinforcers, you remove a specific reinforcer, and that is response cost negative punishment. So to give you an example of this, let's say that this child here, it's their birthday, and they get this toy, this little Smurf car right down there. And, the parents have told this child before, no foul language. We don't want you, doing any foul language. And the child opens up this toy and goes, "This is the effing greatest mother effing toy I've ever seen." And the parents are like, "Whoa, target behavior, swearing." As a consequence of that, they take away the Smurf car. Specific reinforcer, right? So they take away that Smurf car, and that is the punishment. So negative punishment, they take something away, the swearing goes down, that's negative punishment. But there's a difference here because they only took away that one reinforcer. So this child can still play with the Tonka truck. This child can still have some cake. This child can still go and play with their friends. So other reinforcers are still available, but it's a response cost where they took away a specific reinforcer. And occasionally, because these are on a spectrum, identifying whether or not something is response cost or whether or not something is timeout can get a little bit difficult to establish. So in these examples here, when somebody is being placed in front of the wall and you get to stare at the wall for 2 minutes, that's clearly timeout. When the only thing being taken away from you is your Smurf car, that's clearly response cost. But sometimes those two seem to be mixed. So for example, when we saw Harry, whenever Harry self-abused, the consequence of that self-abuse, there was a negative punishment consequence to that self-abuse. And they say it was 5 minutes of timeout from restraints. But this is one where sometimes it gets a little bit difficult to determine, is this response cost or is this a timeout procedure? So when he self-abused, they took his restraints and they left the room. So on the one hand, it seems like response cost because there was the removal of a specific reinforcer. They specifically removed Harry's restraints. They specifically said, oh, we're going to take your restraints away now for 5 minutes. That's the one and only thing that you're no longer getting in this situation. However, recall that not only did they remove the restraints, but they also left as well. So during those 5 minutes, Harry was left alone. And Harry could no longer earn Cokes and pretzels. He could no longer get good jobs from Dr. Fox. He could no longer earn back his restraints. He could no longer get any of the reinforcers that were being offered to him. So while this one might actually look like response cost, it's more accurately a timeout procedure where all of Harry's reinforcers were removed for that 5 minute period. And for sure, a specific reinforcer was removed. But in addition to that, all the reinforcers were removed. A more clean version of response cost would have been if Dr. Fox said, we're going to work this page. And if we work this page, I'll give you praise and we can have some Coke and pretzels. What do you think about that? And Harry self-injured himself. If Dr. Fox then says, all right, goes to his assistant and says, take these out for 5 minutes, take out his restraints for 5 minutes. The restraints are gone, but Dr. Fox remains and says, all right, let's keep doing this page. If that was the case, that would be response cost because only one reinforcer was removed. However, because everybody left, it's more an example of the timeout procedure. All right, so those are the two major types of negative punishment, and also we took a look at positive punishment. Any questions on anything so far in terms of punishment? All right, so we have those two different types of punishments. So now we're going to take a look at some of the things to be careful about, some of the side effects, things that you want to know to try to be aware of when you're implementing a punishment procedure. So we have the negative punishment, so used to saying reinforcement. Negative punishment of timeout, putting somebody in a timeout situation. This will also actually work for adults as well. So they have done experiments where they have placed adults in timeout procedures and their target behavior will decrease. So that idea of negative punishment as well. Another example of negative punishment that we saw was Dr. Fox's opposite reaction when Harry got close to his face. So the positive punishment contingency that Dr. Fox used was when Harry got close to his face, Dr. Fox got close to his face. So that's positive. Harry does the behavior of going close to his face, and Dr. Fox presents his face to Harry. Going close goes decreases. That's positive punishment. This was an example of negative punishment because Dr. Fox was talking, and as soon as Harry brought his face close to Dr. Fox stopped talking. So he was like, okay, we're going to work a page, and when we're done, we're going to go out for Coke and press. So when Harry's face got close, Dr. Fox removed something. He removed speech. Speech was part of Harry's world when Harry was over here. Dr. Fox was talking. The consequence of Harry moving close was Dr. Fox stopping his talking, basically giving Harry the silent treatment. That's an example of negative, something's being taken away. Harry's close talking decreased. That's an example of negative punishment. All right, so we have negative punishment, we got positive punishment. For negative punishment, we have response cost and timeout procedures. So now let's take a look at if we decide to use these punishment procedures, right? If we decide to implement these punishment procedures, what are some of the problems with punishment, specifically associated with punishment, that are not found when we do reinforcement procedures that we need to be aware of to help us make a decision of whether or not punishment procedures are the way to go? So if you recall, I mean, we just saw examples in Harry's treatment. Dr. Fox did use punishment procedures. And if you remember, each level of the treatment, removing the restraints, brief contingent electric shocks, which they never had to do, full body restraints, which they never had to do, those are all punishment procedures. So what are some of the things that Dr. Fox had to think about before implementing those punishment procedures? Well, let's take a look at the problems that you need to be aware of. So problem number one, punishment of an inappropriate behavior does not directly strengthen the occurrence of an appropriate behavior, and it may simply result in a generalized suppression of behavior. So when Dr. Fox was punishing the self-injurious behavior, that did not guarantee that the good behaviors, the appropriate behaviors that Dr. Fox wanted Harry to do were going to increase. So remember that Dr. Fox was reinforcing all these appropriate behaviors, talking at a correct distance, pointing to the pig, ducks, and goose. Those were all being reinforced to increase those behaviors, because punishment of a target behavior will not necessarily increase the opposite behavior. So if you punish somebody for being mean to their siblings, that's not going to immediately increase them being nice to their siblings. And in fact, it might simply result in a generalized suppression of their behavior. So for example, if you are a parent and you have 2 children and you want them to play nicely together, if you punish inappropriate behavior, so if you punish, for example, fighting, that doesn't mean that cooperative behavior is going to increase. What it means is that the fighting will decrease. So it's a punishment procedure, your fighting will go down. But what can also happen is that it leads to a generalized suppression of all behavior. So it could be that if you punish fighting in these instances, if you say, oh, you guys, we're fighting over the block, well, now neither of you get to play with the block. Response cost procedure, nobody gets to play with the block anymore. Definitely fighting for the block is going to go down because it's a punishment procedure. However, that parent might eventually find that they got one child in one corner playing by themselves. They got the other child in the other corner playing by themselves. And they're like, well, what happened? You guys used to play together. And they're like, yeah, well, these guys wouldn't say it, but they're like, yeah, we don't want to play together anymore. What happened was that the general behavior got suppressed as well. So they did suppress the fighting, but they also suppressed in general the behavior. And if that's not what you want, if that's not the desired outcome, you have to be very careful when you're using that punishment procedure. Problem number 2, now this is a big one. The person delivering the punishment could become a discriminative stimulus for punishment. So when you're punishing somebody, you typically have to be there. And if you are present when that punishment contingency is put into place, you are the discriminative stimulus for punishment. And children figure this out rather quickly, right? They oftentimes, if you have one parent that's more lenient than another parent, they very often figure out which parent they can get away with things for, and the other parent becomes a discriminative stimulus for punishment. The reason we don't like this is that the result is that the unwanted behavior will only be suppressed when that punishing person is present. Try saying that 3 times fast. When the punishing person is present, that's the only time that the behavior is going to be suppressed. What you want is a general suppression of bad behaviors. You don't want to only suppress behaviors when you're present and the behavior's back as soon as you're not. So a kind of classic example of this, if you've ever heard of these stories about children who, the parents get called into a parent-teacher interview, right? It's time for the parent-teacher conference. So they're going into the school and they're like, oh my gosh, we're going to have to sit here and hear about how horrible our child is. We're going to have to sit here and listen to just how bad his behavior is, and oh my goodness, I can't, we'll just get through it. Let's just go and rip it off like a Band-Aid. And they go in there and they sit down and they're talking to the teacher and they're like, all right, tell me about little Johnny. And the teacher goes, oh, little Johnny, he is an angel. What a delight. What a wonderful little human being. And the parents are like, really, little Johnny, like little demon Johnny, the one that is like destroying my house whenever, they're there. And they're like, yeah, demon at home, angel at school. What's going on here? The teacher has become a discriminative stimulus for punishment. So any bad behaviors that little Johnny did while the teacher was present were punished, probably with negative punishment, the takeaway of recess, the takeaway of other reinforcers. And because of that, she became a discriminative stimulus for that punishment procedure, so the behaviors were only reduced when she was present. So when this child was at school and the teacher was present, bad behaviors were reduced. When the child was at home, bad behaviors were not reduced. And again, that is another problem with punishment. It only becomes a discriminative stimulus, or the person who's doing the punishment becomes a discriminative stimulus for that punishment. All right, other things to be aware of. Problem number 3, and this is a good one to remember for everybody here who eventually is going to be in charge of other people. So many of you here will eventually be bosses or in supervisor positions or own your own business and employ other people. So one thing that you got to be very, very careful with, and if you've never seen Office Space, I highly recommend checking out just for the Lumberg scenes. But anyways, one thing that you got to be very, very careful with is if you use punishment procedures in your workplace in order to decrease bad behavior or inappropriate behavior by employees. Because one of the things that will lead to is problem number 3, and that is where the punishment contingency might teach the individual to avoid the person that delivers the punishment. So the punishment contingency on its own might cause the individual to actively avoid the person who is giving the punishment. So if you've ever seen Office Space, then you'll know the scene where Lumberg basically gives positive punishment many times when he interacts with his employees. So he comes by and he gives positive punishment in the sense of some of the dialogue that he gives. So there's a scene where one of the individuals did not fill out a memo correctly. No, did not fill out a TPS form correctly. And Lumberg comes by and he's like, yeah, I'm going to need you to go ahead and put the cover page on these TPS memos from now on. And the person's like, yeah, I got that. I made a mistake one time. Yeah, we sent a memo around. I don't know if you saw it. Yeah, I got the memo. The memo's right here on my desk. Yeah, so if you could take a look at that memo and just make sure that the TPS reports have that covered. I mean, he was just like, this one mistake was being laid on over and over and over again in terms of just this condescending positive punishment. And in addition to that, he would actually also had a tendency of cornering people on Friday right before they left for work and saying things like, yeah, I'm going to need you to go ahead and come in on Saturday. There's some, reports that need to be done. And if you can also just come in on Sunday, that'd be great. Yeah, we'll do that. So again, this idea of negative punishment. Now you're removing somebody's weekend. He used punishment in order to decrease the behaviors that he wanted to get decreased. Because of this, every employee avoided him like the plague. Every employee tried to get out on Friday afternoon, sneak out of the building, avoid where Lumberg was, know where your exit strategy is, know where Lumberg's kind of migration pattern is, so that you can avoid him and get out. And if you are trying to modify people's behaviors, that is not a good outcome. Being avoided is not a good outcome because it short circuits the punishment procedure. Because if you cannot interact with somebody, you cannot apply the consequences. And if you can't apply the consequences, you can't change the behavior, and you've short circuited the entire contingency. Now note that this is only a problem with punishment procedures. So I'll give you an example of this, one that a lot of you will probably be experiencing in the next few years. If you go to graduate school and you have a supervisor, working with a supervisor who uses reinforcement procedures in order to modify your behavior is way better than working with a supervisor who uses punishment procedures to modify their behavior. So when I was doing my graduate work in psychology, my supervisor, John Kennedy, if you're watching, at University of Toronto, he used reinforcement to increase the appropriate and good behaviors that I was doing. So there were so many times when I would, have some results and I would have a report and I'd be sitting there and I'd be thinking to myself, well, this isn't that great. And oh man, I don't know what we're going to do with this. But I got to go see my supervisor. So, let's get this over with. This is garbage. And I went in there and I handed it to him and he read it and he was like, this is amazing. This is absolutely fabulous. Oh my gosh, do you know what this means? Oh, we got to publish this. We got to put this into at a conference. We definitely got to get this, report it to people. And that made me much more likely to seek him out because all of that praise, all of that positive reinforcement, anytime that I got results or anytime that I had a draft of, my thesis or anything done, I would actively look for John and I would actively be like, oh, I want to show him this, because I was under the contingency of positive reinforcement. I knew other graduate students with other supervisors who clearly had punishment contingencies being placed upon them because they actively avoided their supervisors. So they were the ones where if they were walking out of their lab and they saw their supervisor down the hall, they would like quickly turn back in and be like, I hope he didn't see me. And that's because they had been placed under a punishment contingency. Now I ask you, if there was ever a problem with either me or this other student, who had the better chance of having their behavior corrected? The person who actively sought out his supervisor whenever they could, or the person who was avoiding their supervisor? So when I ran into problems, I didn't know how to draft a submission for a conference, or, I didn't know how to run a particular statistical analysis, I sought out my supervisor. And I said, you know what? I'm not going to actively avoid him. He's not a discriminative stimulus for punishment. Let me go talk to my supervisor, see what he says about this. On the other hand, everybody else with punishing supervisors, they were like, oh my gosh, I don't know how to do this, but I better avoid my supervisor because I don't need punishment heaped on top of this. And they actively avoided the people that could shape their behavior. So bear that in mind, all the future bosses and executives in here. If you're going to use a punishment procedure to change behavior, be very, very careful to make sure that you do not become a discriminative stimulus for punishment that your employees then actively avoid. And if you find yourself in a job where you're actively avoiding your boss, ask yourself just what kind of contingencies they place on you. Chances are they're punishment contingencies. All right, problem number 4. Punishment is likely to elicit a strong emotional response. So this is something that you have to be ready for when you're dealing with punishment. So punishment can lead to anger, punishment can lead to crying, punishment can lead to arguments, punishment can lead to all sorts of strong emotional responses. Reinforcement does not, right? So reinforcement does not lead to so much happiness that somebody breaks down and starts sobbing on the floor, right? That doesn't happen with reinforcement. I've never been punched for reinforcing somebody. I've never been yelled at for reinforcing somebody, but I have been hit and yelled at for punishing somebody. So be aware that punishment oftentimes leads to these strong emotional responses that you have to be prepared for. And that is tied into number 5, that punishment can sometimes elicit a rather aggressive reaction. So nobody aggresses towards you when you reinforce them, right? Nobody is so overcome with emotion that they're going to assault you when you reinforce them, but that is something that can definitely happen in a punishment situation. So get ready for those types of side effects, those types of problems, if you are implementing a punishment procedure. All right, problem number 6. And this is a big one, especially if you're in a position of authority. And it has to do with the fact that your punishment contingency that you are implementing through the process of modeling, and we're going to talk a lot more about observational behavior and modeling, but basically as an example, if you punish somebody, you could teach that person that punishment is an acceptable means of controlling behavior. All right, so if you punish a child by taking away their toys, you are teaching them that taking away stuff is an appropriate way to change somebody's behavior. And this is probably one of the biggest reasons why spanking is no longer seen as an appropriate way of modifying behavior. Because if you're spanking a child to decrease their target behavior, what they're basically learning is that physical assault is an appropriate way of, or an acceptable way of changing behavior. So what are they going to do if somebody ever confronts them with a behavior that they don't want, that they want to decrease? Well, they might get into a fight, they might get into physical assault, they might do an inappropriate contingency because, again, they're being modeled by being under those punishment contingencies. All right, problem number 7. This is a big one. Well, they're all big ones. But this one is especially kind of susceptible to our own human biases and our own human weaknesses and our own human programming. And that is the idea that punishment is often strongly reinforced. So I'll give you a kind of hypothetical example, and then we'll take a look at a real example. So let's say that you have a child that is yelling, right? You have a child that is just being too loud, right? Not aggressively loud. Let's say that they just saw the trailer for Bohemian Rhapsody, and they're walking around, and at the top of their lungs, they're going, Mamma mia, mamma mia, mamma mia, right? And they're just yelling at the top of their lungs. Let's say that you think to yourself, that target behavior I cannot allow. I'm going to punish this target behavior. So you put them in timeout. You put them in timeout. Singing loudly was the target behavior. The consequence of it is that they're placed in timeout and they're not allowed to sing anymore. And that's going to result in them singing less. An example of negative punishment. You took away their reinforcers, their singing went down, negatively punished. But notice that they're not the only ones that are under a contingency. Because what has happened is your world, the person that actually implemented the punishment, their world was filled with the loud singing of a child, right? Their world was filled, with, Mamma Mia Figaro's for the last 5 minutes. That's what was present in their world. When they punished that child, that noise, that loudness, that singing got taken away. That takeaway is a negative aspect, and it actually makes the punishment more likely to increase in the future, negative reinforcement. So whenever somebody punishes somebody else for a target behavior, and that target behavior stops or decreases, what happens is that the person who's punishing gets negatively reinforced for punishing. And as we all know, when you are reinforced, that increases the frequency with which you will apply the target behavior, in this case punishment, and it also increases the intensity with which you will apply this punishment. So punishment is often strongly reinforced, and you need to have hard lines when you're punishing individuals. So for example, without hard lines, this parent might say to their child, you know what? I can't have you singing that song anymore. I told you don't sing it. So time out for 2 minutes. For 2 minutes, you're going to sit in the corner. You're going to be quiet, right? 2 minutes. Child comes out. Mamma mia, mamma mia, mamma mia, Figaro, right? And you're like, no, back in there. 4 minutes, right? A couple of days later, child does another target behavior. You're like, no, get into the corner. 10 minutes. A couple of days later, child does another behavior. You're like, no, into the corner, 20 minutes, right? You are being negatively reinforced for punishing this child because the target behavior that they're doing, when you punish them, that target behavior gets taken away. That's negative. It's reinforcing. Your punishment is going to go up. So the tendency is for punishment to get out of hand. And eventually your child does something and you're like, 2 hours. You are in the corner for 2 hours. This is an extreme example, but you can see how punishment gets ramped up and ramped up and ramped up. And if you ever talk to elderly individuals who were back in the day, who were raised back in the day when spanking was an approved method of modifying behavior, you will hear horror stories of how hard they got spanked. Nobody started out getting spanked that hard, but the spanker got negatively reinforced for doing that spanking. And this is something that needs to be controlled. So you'll notice that the way to control this in this hypothetical example with the child is oftentimes you'll hear child psychologists say that if you want to use timeout, you do 30 seconds for every year that the child has been alive. That's a good amount of time to go timeout. So if they're 7 years old, they go to timeout for 3.5 minutes. If they're 10 years old, you get 5 minutes of timeout. Notice what that does. It has a hard line, right? So it has a clear boundary. So regardless of how much you're getting reinforced for punishing this individual, you have that rule in your head that you're not going to go above 3.5 minutes because your child is only 7 years old. That means that you're not going to get out of hand through negative reinforcement for your punishment. Notice that Dr. Fox had that as well. Notice that his punishment contingencies were very detailed and very objectively precise. So we're going to take the restraints out for 5 minutes. They were not going to take the restraints out until they cool down, right? They weren't going to say things like, you know what, time out, we're going to leave this with these restraints, and then wait outside in the hallway and say, are you ready to go back in? No, I'm not ready to go back in. How about you? No, I need some more time. All right, let's take some more time. Because if they did that through the process of negative reinforcement, Harry would have ended up 20 minutes in that room without, during the timeout procedure. So they said, no, bright boundaries, 5 minutes of timeout. That's what we're doing. Brief contingent electric shocks. We're going to, put them in a full body restraint. They had limits defined to avoid the propensity for punishment to get out of hand in terms of the amount that the punisher is punishing people. And this is one of the things that oftentimes leads to very excessive use of punishment. So when we saw the Rodney King beating, that was massively excessive use of police force, right? That was just like way, way beyond. And you take a look at something like that, and you ask yourself, or you can ask yourself, how did these policemen ever become policemen, right? If this was the level of abuse that they were, exhibiting, if this was the amount of beatings that they were given to their, to their suspects, how did they ever become police officers? How was this ever, approved? And the answer is that they didn't start out at that particular level. So anytime that somebody is being positively punished, in this case, Rodney King was being positively punished, the people that are punishing are also under a contingency. So when Rodney King did some target behavior, and again, this is one of the aspects of the trial that people didn't see the first seconds of footage. It takes a while for somebody back then to open up their camera case, take out their camera, press the power button, put it up on your shoulder, make sure that it's focused. It takes some time, so we don't know what happened at the beginning. But target behavior, presentation of something, which was force, behavior decreases, that's positive punishment. But during that positive punishment, and during every single previous time that these police officers implemented police force as a positive punishment procedure, they were actually under a contingency of their own, and they were being negatively reinforced. Because when Rodney King did his target behavior, right, that target behavior was part of the police officer's world, right? That target behavior was part of the police officer's world. Let's just, to make it a concrete example, let's say that it was a verbal behavior. Let's say that the verbal behavior was Rodney King going up to the police officer saying, "Why'd you pull me over? I didn't do anything. I didn't do anything. I'm innocent. I didn't do anything. Why'd you pull me over? Why was I pulled over? I didn't do anything." That verbal behavior is part of these police officers' world. What happens, though, is that as soon as they punish Rodney King, as soon as that first baton hit Rodney King on his head, something was taken away from the police officer's world. And what was taken away was Rodney King talking, right? So that verbal behavior that was occurring, that was taken away. That led to a behavior increase. That's negative reinforcement. So every single time that these officers used positive punishment on a suspect or a citizen or, in a police encounter, they were being negatively reinforced for the use of that punishment. And that made their punishment more probable, and that also made their punishment more severe. So just like the child piano student who starts off barely being able to play the piano, and through shaping, through reinforcement, learns to play the piano like a pro, like a absolute professional. In the same way, somebody in the police academy, when they first start out, when they're a rookie, when it's their first day on the job, they're going to have certain behaviors, and those behaviors are going to be variable. So let's say that one of these behaviors is the use of positive punishment, is the use of police force. When they use that police force, it's going to get reinforced, right? So not using police force, using other methods, might fall away, but the use of police force is going to get negatively reinforced. And what that means is that their new behavior is going to be variations of that new level of police force. When they do that new behavior on the next suspect who is doing a target behavior that they want to decrease, if they use that police force and that behavior stops, they're going to be negatively reinforced again. And throughout their experience and throughout their history, they're going to continue to get negatively reinforced until the point that they're beating Rodney King over and over and over again. So when you, if anybody here is looking at, or interested in ways to stop police brutality, ways to, programs that could be instituted in order to reduce the amount of police brutality that occurs, you don't want to start by taking a look at the police academies. You don't want to start by taking a look at the police academies and saying, how are these horrible, horrible individuals, how are these individuals over here ever making it through police academy? We have to overhaul the educational system for our police officers. We have to overhaul the training that we give them, because we have to make sure that we weed out these very, very violent individuals. That's the wrong approach, because here, they're not very, very violent. What happens, though, is through negative reinforcement, they become very, very, very violent. And that's one of the biggest dangers of a punishment procedure. So what you would want to do is you would want to not screen out anybody that's extremely violent here, because they already have those measures. But what you would want to do is you would want to understand how this negative reinforcement works, and you would want to start making police officers aware of these bright boundaries, these bright criteria, where you've crossed the line if you've done this, you haven't crossed the line if you've done this. All right, so if you are going to be using punishment as a procedure, make sure that you place limits on the amount of punishment that you give out that are easily identified, because by the very nature of punishment, you are likely to get out of hand because your punishment is being negatively reinforced. All right, any questions, comments on the problems to be aware of when you're implementing a punishment procedure? All right, so we talked about some of the problems that arise with punishment. We'll end today with some of the actual benefits of implementing a punishment procedure. So it's not all doom and gloom. There are actually some benefits, some sort of positive side effects to using punishment. And it's good to be aware of those, because sometimes those positive side effects are exactly what you want. So you can get a kind of double whammy where you decrease an inappropriate behavior and at the same time have a positive side effect, which improves the lives of the person being punished. Let's take a look at what some of those are. Benefit number one, punishment can sometimes lead to an increase in social behavior. And this is a weird, kind of counterintuitive thing to realize, but it is actually the case where punishment can sometimes actually increase the amount that somebody wants to interact with you. So this is usually because we have built-in evolutionary drives in us, behavior drives, to indicate to somebody that a fight is over. So most animals in our world will fight, right? So if you've ever taken a look at, if you've ever seen video of mountain goats, right, rams, just continually like smacking each other, on the head with their rams, basically saying, my horns are bigger than yours and I'm taking this territory and, we're going to fight, right? They do not fight to the death. Eventually, one of the rams, without being overly injured, without being maimed, without one of them, no longer being able to find food for themselves, eventually one of them is going to say, look, this punishment procedure, this contingency that you have me under, this is too much. So I'm going to show you an appeasement behavior. I'm going to kind of bow low or show you my soft underbelly or whatever it is that the species does. And they show you this behavior, and it indicates, the fight is over, we're done, we're through, we're good, I'm backing off, it's all yours. Humans have the same thing. And in humans, it's actually a social behavior. So for example, if you punish an individual, they might actually interact with you more. They might actually be more affectionate towards you. And that is because they're trying to tell you, hey, we had this fight, we had this battle, and you've won, so we don't need to do this anymore. and let me give you a hug, just to kind of show you, yes, this is, this is the correct, the fight is over. So it's kind of counterintuitive because you figure if you're going to punish somebody, you might get them up in their defensive and they're about to, retract from you. But oftentimes that punishment can lead to an increase in social behavior. So how can you use this? What might this be a benefit for? Well, if you are dealing with individuals who lack social behavior, if they're loners, if they're isolated, if they just don't seem to want to interact with you, you might, as a psychologist, say to yourself, you know what, let me try a punishment contingency. Let me see what happens when I punish this individual. And by punishing them, you might bring out that innate mechanism that tells them, you know what, I better interact with this person a little bit just to show them that I'm okay, or that we're good now. And then that can lead to an increase in social behavior that you can then, positively reinforce and build on. All right, benefit number 2, punishment can sometimes result in an improvement in mood. So this is also something that seems counterintuitive. Why would anybody want to be punished? Why would anybody be punished and then sort of say to themselves, oh, I feel so much better, right? Oh, I've been put in timeout. Oh, thank goodness, I feel so much better. And one of the reasons that I think this is the case is because human beings react very poorly to unfairness. They react very poorly, or they have very kind of gut adversity towards things that are unfair. And if you've harmed somebody else, if you've done a target behavior that is worth punishment, and you do not get punished, chances are you're going to feel rather bad about it. So if you've ever harmed a friend of yours, and this is probably something we're all familiar with, let's say that you've done something to your friend, and it was a bad behavior, and you've harmed your friend, and and your friend, you go to your friend and you're like, oh my gosh, oh, I've harmed you, and your friend is like, you know what, forget it. And you're looking at your friend going, no, like, punish me. I feel horrible. Please do something. Please, yell at me a little bit. Please, break my new PlayStation 4 or whatever. I don't know. Like, you're like, please punish me. Don't just let it go, because you feel horrible and you'll feel better once you get punished. So punishment can oftentimes lead to an improvement of mood. So once again, if you have somebody that's in a bad mood that you're dealing with, and they're in a low mood, they're in a poor mood, you might say to yourself, all right, if I see an inappropriate behavior, I'm going to use a punishment procedure, because I can use the side effects of punishment to increase their mood and improve their mood as a result of this natural mechanism that sometimes makes you feel better when you're actually punished. All right, and punishment, benefit number 3, punishment can often lead to increased attention to the environment. So people that are used to being under a punishment contingency will oftentimes be very, very aware of their environment. And one of the places where this is oftentimes seen is in individuals who were bullied in their past. Bullying is basically being under a punishment contingency. You say the wrong thing, you get hit. That's positive punishment. You have lunch money, it gets taken away. That's negative punishment. And because they have been required to avoid the discriminative stimulus for punishment, which is the bully, right? So they try to avoid them as much as they can. They have to be hyper attentive to their environment. So if you've ever interacted with somebody who's been bullied, or if you yourself have been bullied, they are probably more aware of what's going on around their environment. So they will notice cars when they're passing outside. They will notice people walking in and out of the different classrooms. They will notice a door that opens and closes. They'll notice a pencil that fell, somewhere else. So that increase in attention is a natural outcome of being punished. What you can do, again, look for ways if you need to punish somebody, or if you need to increase somebody's attention to the environment, look for chances to implement a punishment procedure to naturally take advantage of this benefit. So if you have somebody, if you have an individual that you have authority over that you can punish, and they are just inattentive, they just do not pay attention, right? So they're running into walls because they're not paying attention where they're going. They're knocking over laptops because they're not paying attention where they're moving their arms. They're harming themselves. You know, so if you ever have like one of those children who constantly, you know, waves their arms and hits it against a chair, and they're like, ow, you know, my chair. And then they turn to move and they're like, boom, their knee on the table, and they're like, ah, my knee. If you have somebody who's inattentive to the environment and it's harming them, one way to increase their attention to the environment is to put them under a punishment procedure. So you might say, all right, well, what's a target behavior that we want to decrease? All right, let's decrease this target behavior. And a benefit of using that punishment procedure is that I'm going to help them become more attentive to their environment, and they're not going to injure themselves on their furniture as much anymore. All right, so those are the benefits of punishment. Kind of out of time. Next time, we're going to take a look at the effective use of punishment. So if you're going to do punishment, make sure that it's as effective as possible. We'll take a look at that next time. But any final questions or comments before we wrap it up for today? It's all good? All right, so a few things to think about if you're going to put in a punishment procedure. And next time, we'll take a look at how to make that as effective as possible.